How many people here, this is the first time you've been to a AIC event? How many of you are already working in county government somewhere? How many are not? God bless you. Godspeed in the coming year. How many county auditors do we have here? Okay, keep your hands up a minute. These are the people that you've got to keep happy. All the rest of you guys. It's kind of like my marriage of 45 years. I get up every morning and I say, how can I make Pam happy today? It's worked. The one thing I do is make it to Starbucks and back before she comes down to the kitchen and has her coffee sitting on the counter. And I kind of figure if I don't do anything for the rest of the day, I've got that to fall back on. Now, when you go to the courthouse every day, when you think about how can I make the auditor happy today, an auditor can make your life fun or it can make it miserable. And everything kind of collides and passes through the auditor's office. How many county council members do we have with us today? These are the people you really have to make happy and you have to suck up to. These are the ones where you have to make your case every summer that my deputy's worth more than the one across the hall. And I'll tell you why. But so much of what we cover in these workshops are really intended to do a couple things. One is to inform you on what are good practices and how we can best operate our offices efficiently, also with an eye on avoiding litigation and avoiding problems. And Tim Drury and I have been working together for quite some time. Tim's business and our business are a little different, but there's one constant, and that is how can we reduce risk? How can we keep people out of trouble? And how can we minimize the damage once they're in trouble? And that's probably the majority of our work. Realizing that 95% of the employees in county government are dedicated. They come, they do a good day's work for a good day's pay. We deal with the 3 or 4% or the problem kids who all of a sudden something has gone wrong in their life or something has gone wrong at work, and now the employer is the bad guy. And how can I milk out a benefit? How can I go on ADA because I'm stressed? You're not stressed, you're not doing your work, you're about ready to get fired, but all of a sudden the FMLA comes in handy when you need a way to protect yourself. So we come at it from a little different perspective, and we do these classes throughout the year, and today we're just going to hit a few of the peaks, and it's really aimed at newly elected officials and what are some of the things that you can do to prepare yourself coming into office and what you might look at, particularly when you consider the employees and the practices and the policies that go into operating these offices that are very important. At each one of the tables, I don't know if you've got the handouts yet, but we left on the corner, there's 4 handouts that are entitled Crazy Things That Happen at Work. It's got my name on the front of it. I'm going to be working from that one. Tim has some others that he's left there regarding some specific issues, and we'll be talking about that as we go along. One of the things we want to make sure is we keep you out of the headlines in the next few years. I don't know if the State Board of Accounts covered this, but this past year, some of the public officials had trouble with credit cards. Personally, I wouldn't want one if I were in county government, but the use of credit cards and taking them down to the casino and misplacing them for your own card when you go through the ATM. It's kind of a red flag for those State Board of Accounts guys that were here earlier. But we had some strange uses here in 2014 from $700 designer purses that was given to an employee as a gift. Didn't go over too well. 20-year employee ended up losing their position over that. There was an $18,000 mail order charge to purchase novelty items, travel and Crown Royal and gift cards and kids' tuitions. Those are things that all kind of catch the eye of the auditors and get people in trouble. This past year, you may know, we had a couple sheriffs who got in trouble, both with the same prostitute. Yeah, about 100 miles apart in counties, but $300 for sex on credit cards, which again, not a good idea. So those are some of the things that kind of make the headlines, and I think they give all public officials a black eye, and are things to avoid. If you look at the handout from me, excuse me, where it says first things first, I'm going to go through these and try to tie them into some examples that will give you some food for thought. Under first things first, one of the things that we would recommend coming into office is that you review the existing job descriptions. Now, there should be job descriptions already in place for most of the jobs in county government. And just as an aside, our company has worked with over 60 Indiana counties. I know that Bliss McKnight has as well. You may already be a client of ours. And if you have follow-up questions and need for some assistance later on, check with your county commissioners, check with your county auditor or attorney to see if we're already engaged and are available. And there's a good likelihood that we are, and we have prepared a number of counties' job descriptions that are in place right now, as well as personnel policies. But review those descriptions, make sure they're complete, make sure they're accurate. Are they reflective of what's going on? If you've never been in that office or coming to county government for the first time, this is kind of a good place to start in terms of being able to assess who's assigned what and what the job requirements are of each of the positions. What are the knowledges or certificates that are required to do the job? What's the reporting relationship? Who's a deputy reporting to? Is there a structure or an organizational reporting relationship within the office? What are the work schedules? What's the physical effort and mental demands of the job? So all those pieces are likely to be a part of the job description. What is the FLSA status? FLSA stands for Fair Labor Standards Act. It's a federal law, and it sets out the requirements for employee overtime. And employees who are required to receive overtime need to be designated as non-exempt to the FLSA. Exempt employees, however, are not required to be paid overtime under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Most job descriptions, or all job descriptions, should have that designation so that the employee knows what their status is when they're hired and how they should be compensated respective of the overtime rules. To be exempt from the FLSA, the position needs to be either a professional, an executive, or an administrative position. Administrative definitions under the FLSA are very narrow. It sounds like a wide umbrella type blanket that we could throw over a lot of jobs and they would meet that requirement, but it's a narrow definition. Those jobs need to have some kind of supervisory responsibility over others. They need to be applying knowledge that they have learned through attainment of a degree. Those are the qualities that will exempt a position. Most of the jobs in county government are non-exempt, but they're paid a salary. All these salaried jobs are exempt, Kent. No, they're not. No, they're not. Just because we're paid on a salary basis, which does not automatically mean that the job is is exempt. And that's one of the misconceptions that I think a lot of people have with those terms. Because through the years, if you're salaried, you're on a salary, and that covers all your time worked. It does for exempt employees. But just because the deputy in the treasurer's office is paid on a salary basis does not make them a non-exempt employee. They're performing standard and routinized duties that don't require or they're not supervising other people. They're not in a policy-making type position, and they don't meet any of the tests that would make them exempt under the FLSA. So there's just a few jobs within the county that are actually going to fit within that category. Department heads, the superintendent of highways, yes, that one's going to be most likely an exempt position. But the other jobs that fall under that in a highway department even become a little more questionable. A foreman may be classified as exempt, but if that foreman is actually doing the work of those workers in the highway department, the truck drivers, the operators, the laborers, and they're doing that most of the time, the title is not what is going to determine the status of the position. So we have to be very careful to make sure that those positions are classified properly and we don't have somebody classified as exempt who is actually non-exempt and who's eligible for overtime or comp time, which I've labeled the crack cocaine of local government. Something we get hooked on, we can't get off, everybody loves it, but it's very expensive. Now, we can talk about that for a long time, but the fact is we want to make sure that those jobs are classified properly, that the people that are holding those positions, if they do go over 40 hours in a work week, that they do receive time and a half in wages, or that they receive an hour and a half of comp time for every hour that they work in excess of 40. The FLSA can be very costly in terms of having a violation or a complaint. All it takes is a call to the Department of Labor, and they're obligated to come in and investigate that complaint. And when it comes to local government, it really becomes cumbersome and problematic, particularly with county government. And it's this beast of county government with all the various elected offices and departments, and we'll get some elected officials, courts, prosecutors, others, who nobody's the boss of me, and you can't tell me what to do. And I'm not going to be turning over time records to the auditor because he or she doesn't need to see them. And I'll do what I want, and my employees are my employees, and there's fairy dust sprinkled all over the courthouse with that kind of thinking. However, the FLSA applies to all county offices, all jobs within the county outside of elected officials. The elected official is excluded or exempt from the FLSA. Everybody else is covered in some way. So, as Madison County learned about 11 years ago from a complaint, that the investigator arrived and said, look, we want see the time records of these employees that are complaining. She kind of got stonewalled for a while, but after a while, those records started filtering out. But she kind of made a left turn and said, I think there's some violations throughout the county building. I think there's violations in other offices outside of the ones that are just complaining. So I'm going to make this a comprehensive audit. So she required every elected official, every department head, courts, prosecutor, sheriff, everyone to reconstruct their time records for the past 3 years for all current and former employees during that period and show how the time was recorded and whether or not those people were paid properly, respective of the Fair Labor Standards Act and the overtime rules. I mean, we had some people say, well, you know, council didn't give me any money for overtime, so it really doesn't matter what you tell me to do. I don't have any money in my budget to pay any back pay, so I'm not going to, you know, do anything. Which is kind of like telling the IRS audit that you really didn't budget for any extra money this year. You know, you paid your taxes and you didn't think you were going to be owed anything, so since I didn't have it budgeted, I'm not going to be paying. That didn't get very far with her. But at the end of the day, what had happened, this took about 3 years from start to finish. It wasn't, you know, here today, gone tomorrow. In fact, a lot of the employees there in the courthouse thought that she was their union steward. And, well, so-and-so's been coming in late. They'd call her and trigger some kind of a follow-up to, why is the probation department coming in at 9 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock? Well, she wanted to know. She wanted to get to the bottom of this. So there are a number of those issues that occurred during the course of that audit. And the bottom line was the 6 employees who initiated the call in the first place were jailers who were working full-time for the sheriff and who were working part-time in security for community corrections. They weren't bringing their time together and paying overtime for that extra time. The argument was tried, didn't work. Well, those are 2 different departments. That's completely different. That's sheriff, that's, you know, the court programs. Who signs a check? Madison County. Madison County is the employer, regardless of where you are. So when we have people in one office working for another one, and sometimes we don't even know it's happening, that's a potential red flag. It's a potential liability if that person's holding a non-exempt position and we're not bringing the time together to determine any of those hours that exceed 40 having to be paid at time and a half. Another issue that came out of that audit was the fact that some people were giving what's called longevity pay. How many of your counties have longevity pay in some fashion? Well, longevity pay in their case at that time was awarded in a separate check later in the year, but everybody got some kind of a longevity increment. The FLSA requires that all remuneration, all compensation be put together, and that's how you figure the overtime rate. So if I'm getting $2,000 of longevity pay on top of my $37,000 job, I have to add the $2,000 to the 35 and base my overtime rate on the 37,000, not the 35. That was a problem. So there was a number of people who ended up getting $300, $400, $500, $600 in back pay for that 3-year period who were not paid properly. These are things that we want to avoid. The K-9 officer made off with $13,000. Just like turn it into a retirement program. Why would he get $13,000? K-9 officers get at least an hour. There's nothing written down unless they keep a log. But they have to be compensated 365 days a year for the care and grooming of the dog unless it's kenneled, or they're not responsible for it. So those guys get that extra hour safe every day of the year. Now, you just have to figure that out and make it a part of their salary or give them time off and flex their schedule, but they hadn't done that. And in that particular case, the K-9 officer made off with the $13,000. Well, you know, these checks start rolling out, and hey, how can I cash in on that? There was a jailer there who had since been terminated who heard about this program and says, hey, wait a minute, you owe me money. I came to work and clocked in, and what he did, he clocked in. He went to the Sally Port and smoked cigarettes for a half hour every day, but he clocked in. He was arriving early because of a transportation issue. But the record showed that he was working a half an hour extra every day. He wanted paid. His nickname was Officer Lazy. They had trouble getting him to work when he was actually to be working. They had trouble pulling him off the Sally Port and getting him into the jail to work. It took about 12 depositions from employees, supervisors at the jail, to show this DOL investigator that this really wasn't a legitimate claim and for her to back off. Bottom line, they spent over $500,000 in back pay, the time and effort that it went through, and finally ended up with her leaving the kingdom and finding another one to investigate. But I guess some of the good things that came out of it was people actually started keeping track of time properly and turning it in, and there was an official record in the auditor's office about how people were to be paid. Sometimes the auditor's the last one to know. Or somebody gets hired and they hear about it 3 weeks later. Hey, Joe needs a paycheck out the highway department. Hell, we didn't even Joe was on the payroll. Well, yeah, that's kind of just the way we would do it around here. The FLSA is a very important rule, policy, should be a part of your policies, and is something that can cost you a lot of money if it's not administered properly. And if you have employees keeping record of their time and there's no record from the employer, guess whose record that the DOL will take? They'll take that employee's record over no record. So it's incumbent upon us to have time-keeping systems that can document that kind of required information. G, policy-making, supervisory, confidential. We need to be able to tell whether or not a job is a politically appointed position or if it is not. And the case that's the poster child for this particular point is Delaware County, where new auditor comes into office and day one fires 8 people and replaces them with friends and relatives, because that's how we've always done it around here. Nobody ever questioned it before. Why are we doing it now? Well, those 8 people took off to federal court and filed a wrongful termination suit, and about 3 years later, won. The judge says, look, just because you stamp my name on a document doesn't make you the auditor. That does not cut it. You're doing ministerial duties. These are not policy making. And long story short, ordered that all 8 be returned to work if they wanted their jobs back. I think 6 of them did, with back pay for those 3 years, with attorney's fees and other penalties that were added on top of that. The county at that time didn't have the services of Bliss McKnight or another carrier, so they had to pass a special tax to pay for that lawsuit. It's a hard lesson to learn, and one that we just can't stand there and try to make reason out of the fact, well, that's the way we've always done it. Now, somebody may be able to replace somebody in an office and nobody complains, and things go about their merry way, and they'll say, well, see, told you, I could put whoever I want in here. Now, the county tried to argue, well, they're employees at will. We can do anything we want to. I really didn't fire them. I just didn't reappoint them. Oh, now we're parsing words, but the point is they were terminated. And the point is they were reinstated. And it's something I think to be avoided, I highly recommend we avoid putting ourselves in those kinds of positions. Now, does that say that I can't restructure, I can't reorganize my office? No. But my advice is take your time. There's no rush to January 1. And it amazes me. Every once in a while I run to an elected official that was elected in November, and by January 1, they've come into all this phantom knowledge and wisdom about how to run an office that they've never been into before. It's kind of amazing. But I think the word here is to move slowly, look at what's going on, look at the jobs. Can we let people go because they're not performing? Absolutely. But we can't do it on day one if we haven't been there. What are we going to tell the judge? They're going to say it's political. And with the timing of the termination, it's going to be an uphill fight, and it's going to be one that's going to certainly taint the office starting out. So just a strong word of caution there. I've also noted here that a couple years ago in the AIC magazine, Michael Blickman, who's an attorney at Ice Miller, published a very good article on this topic, and it's still on the website, and I would suggest that you get a copy of it, look at it, and consider it as you move forward. These job descriptions also should have places where people have acknowledged their signature. They've got a copy of it. There's a document that when people receive these descriptions, so they've got that as part of the record, and when you change a description, you go through that same process. Take a look at your personnel policies. Get a copy of the personnel policy. Most generally, the county commissioners have adopted a county-wide policies. Oftentimes, the county council's been involved in that process as well. I suggest that county councils also make reference of the county policy in their salary ordinance each year as a term and condition of compensation, because that policy normally sets out all the paid leave policies. It sets out salary administration issues, which certainly the councils have a lot to say about that. So not that everything in the policy is going to affect the county council, but there are certain pieces of it that certainly will. Those policies may well have a recruitment and hiring process. So there may be in place a process to follow to replace a position. There are some counties that have policies where there's a hiring freeze, that you need to go to the council before you can replace someone who is vacated the position. So you need to become familiar with what those policies are and what those nuances may be with your individual county policy. Already mentioned the salary administration, the overtime, the approval of overtime, which should be something in your office that you have prior approval of anybody who's required to work overtime. There's benefits, leave sections that will guide you in terms of when people earn vacation time, holidays, sick days, etc. Safety, working conditions, and work rules and disciplinary guidelines are normal pieces of the policy. Look at the records requirements that you need to follow respective of the family and medical leave, ADA, workers' comp. Look at past performance evaluations that may be there on employees, past violations of policies, any litigation in the past, any agreements. Madison County officials at the end of that DOL audit were required to sign that they were going to comply with the terms and conditions of the timekeeping and reporting requirements of the county, and then any future violations would result in punitive damages to the county. And then we're getting into some bigger dollars. So there may be some things that have gone on in advance of you coming to office that you need to know about that affect the employment relationship with the employees in your office. Number 4, have a meeting with your staff, and here's just some general kinds of ideas to discuss. But I think the one thing that's most important is that you kind of set the tone from day one. You have one time to make a first impression. It's like teaching the first day coming to class. I'm not talking about the county rules. What are the rules that you want for your office? What are your expectations for your staff? How do you want the customers to be treated? How do you want the telephone answered? And how do you want this exchange with the public, and particularly in all communications? What's your attendance policy respective of how you want it reported? Are you going to, for example, allow people to just leave voicemails or text or emails, or do you want to be personally contacted in advance if somebody is going to be absent, particularly if it's not an emergency type absence? So what are your expectations regarding your overall operations? What are the timekeeping requirements? What about breaks or meal periods, and how's the office going to be covered? Particularly if there's a small office, if you're going to be open during the meal period, how's that going to be done? What is the policy on the use of cell phones, text, social media? And this is becoming increasingly important. Are you going to allow texting during the workday? I know one sheriff who's banned cell phones from the jail for all the correction officers. My God, you'd have thought it was World War III. Well, what if there's an emergency, Sheriff? Well, 911's right there. You know, we will get you. But we're not going to have that kind of interruption that jeopardizes the public safety, that jeopardizes your safety or other workers in the jail when somebody's on their phone all day long. The same holds true for the office. I mean, is work time, or are there going to be times when that's allowable? What's allowable for use on the computers that are owned by the county? So those are the kinds of questions you may want to think about. How you want your employees to behave regarding social media. We get questions pretty frequently now about people posting things that are derogatory about other workers, about the county in general, about their boss, and that's the kind of thing that we want to make sure that A, we have a policy, but B, what are the sanctions for people who violate those policies, so it's clear and they understand that, and you're the newly elected official and you can make that call in terms of your expectation. So, what they may have gotten by with the past administration may be a little bit different than what your expectations are. So that is one of the main things I think in the courthouse offices that elected officials need to think about. And what's your dress code? What do you expect in terms of people? What can they wear to work? I've seen flip-flops. I've seen pajama bottoms. I've seen swimwear. Is that acceptable? Maybe it is, but if it's not in your office, you need to let people know what's expected in terms of how they should be dressed for work. Ethics and the public trust, what are our expectations? Whatever those employees do, reflect on the elected office holder. They're an extension of that elected office holder. And I'd write some of this out in terms of the work rules of the office and make sure they sign it, as well as they sign other policies. I think the biggest thing is that you don't let problems fester. I'd like $1 for every time I've heard, oh, if only I'd have taken care of this when I came in the office. I've let this thing go on for 3 years, and this woman's a pain in the ass. And she has been from day one, and I put up with it. And all the other employees in the office have had to, pull her load, and I have just had it to hear. Have you documented any of it? No. Have you talked to her about it? No. But I'm going to fire her tomorrow. Wait a minute. How have we treated other people in similar situations? Who is she going to point to? Who is she going to point to? Now, believe me, county employees, if I haven't learned anything, county employees are experts about what's going on across the hall. And they will point to how somebody else was treated in a similar situation, and now you want to come down on me. And we have to be very aware of how we work in this environment. And, it's a matter of who's in charge. Who's in charge? We're going to have the employees telling us they're in charge? Now, believe me, I've been in some offices that's the way it is. Where's the elected office holder? Haven't seen him for a couple weeks. Golfing, training. And how we run our offices and how we behave as elected officials, that's pretty well a personal matter, and the voters make the decision in the end. But the fact is, how we're going to operate that office and what our expectations are on our shoulders. And I think the way to get off onto a good footing is to make sure we have that first meeting and lay out those expectations, and also be very vigilant in terms of monitoring the everyday work and how it's being done, and whether or not corrective action needs to be taken. If people need to be put on some kind of an improvement plan, fine, do it. Had an assessor report to me a while back who his father was the assessor before him, and he still has an employee that his father hired back in the 1970s who claims that when your dad hired me, we had these paper cards, and that's all he told me I was ever going to have to do. Now, you got all these fancy-ass computers around here. I'm not going to learn that stuff. Times changed. I think and he did. He put him through. He gave him training. He had the vendors come in. They spent day after day after day trying to get him up to speed. Nope, I just do these cards. That's all I do, because that's what your daddy told me. That's all I'd ever have to do. Well, he's not here now, and didn't work out. The AIC provides a number of excellent resources for you. There's other auditors, there's other elected officials around that have experience and knowledge that you can always reach out to. Don't hesitate to call. These kinds of settings, I think, are great, where you can talk to other officials, other counties who have many of the same problems you do, how they're handling it, and I think it's an excellent networking situation. As I mentioned early, Tim and I have a number of you already as clients, and we're always ready and willing and able to help you out. So where are we on the time? Do I have time for this? You want to go? I'll come back later with this quiz if we have time and hold any questions until the end. Tim's got a number of things he wants to go over as well.